There is a particular scene in the very first episode of season 3 of Good Girls that got me thinking about comparing the internal relationship between the good girls and the internal relationship of the mean girls. In the scene, the gang is pretty much discussing Beth's relationship with Rio's child. And Beth isn't really having it, so she's kind of like, listen, y'all don't understand how it is when you kill somebody. Ruby is like, hey, listen, I shot someone too. But Annie calls her out and is like, yeah, but you shot somebody's toe. Ruby, however, wasn't having it, at least not the way that she was saying that. Annie kind of comes up with her own phrase on the spot saying, whatever, don't lose your chickens. Which Ruby's like, I don't know what you mean. And Annie's kind of like, yeah, it means like don't have a cow. And Ruby's just kind of like, well, then say don't have a cow. And Annie just kind of like explains why to her it makes more sense to say don't lose your chickens than don't have a cow. And just kind of is like, you know what I mean. But Ruby just kind of shuts her down and says no. Annie's just standing there left to say, well, then that's your problem, and just walks off after being completely shut down by Ruby. It was specifically this scene that got me thinking about their internal relationship and how it parallels in a way the internal relationship of the girls in Mean Girls, the Plastics. Now, if you don't know, I did a video on Good Girls last week, which you can watch over here, I guess. It was gonna be way long, and I did my best to cut it down as short as possible, and hopefully you still found it entertaining for those of you who did watch it. However, a lot of ideas were cut out and left out, and this is one of those ideas, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, their internal structure. Because I kind of saw this parallel way that their kind of situation is structured. What? Because they're both girls? Well, yeah, there's both girls in the title, but I often actually use Mean Girls to talk about structural relationships because they did a good job explaining it in that movie, and it's a big pop cultural reference. I mean, if you were in my generation, it was hard not to know Mean Girls. It was pretty big. Trust me, it's fetch. And I've kind of just assumed that the target demographic of this show, Good Girls, is of a certain mature age that would have been of a younger age, the same target group audience that had watched the Mean Girls movies. So I kind of think it's easy for me to make this comparison when talking about it, at least for that same audience group. So I am just gonna kind of assume sort of that everybody knows what I'm talking about when I talk about things in Mean Girls, though I think you might find this video interesting if you haven't watched either Mean Girls or Good Girls. But if you haven't watched both of them, then I don't know how interesting this video is gonna be. Just watch it anyway, because I'm a nice person and you wanna support me. But the truth is, if you haven't watched Mean Girls, get out. Nobody even likes you. I'm kidding, everyone loves you, stay, please. Mwah. Anyway, I already talked about in the last episode how it's quite clear that Beth is sort of the main character because it's her relationship that makes her center of the other two. Ruby is her best friend and Annie is her sister. That kind of makes her center of this whole triangle. But of course I brought up how there are other reasons, maybe more important reasons, why she is more obviously the main character, namely that she's involved in the most important and interesting plotline of this whole show, the relationship with Rio. But we can also really clearly see how that sort of thing is playing out in the interactions between the women. And their kind of social structure and hierarchy is something that they're certainly exploring more in depth in season 3. It was always there in the previous seasons and then they kind of address it, but it's way more explicit in season 3. For example, they had the scene in the interrogation room where Annie literally explicitly asks about the hierarchy in their relationship. But there are a number of other scenes that also clearly mark how Beth seems to be above the other two. It seems to be that both Ruby and Annie can kind of have this kind of casual or seeming superficial banter about the kind of weird and wacky things that they have to go through in order to be in this world. Such as when they're discussing about how Ruby had to actually touch a plunge's bottom in order for her to be able to rob a restaurant of a supposedly original expensive jersey. Meanwhile, Beth is not even involved in these type of conversations. She doesn't really care to correct Annie or even really get involved in kind of nonsense banter. She's more goal oriented and she's way more thinking about what she needs to do next. Or also this scene where the gang is trying to come up with what to write in Lucy's cell phone to send a message to Max, her boyfriend. Ruby and Annie end up in a kind of nonsense conversation again about whether or not people order soft tacos. But Beth has already moved on. She's not held back by any kind of superficial things. That's why she may be also able to actually dig up a dead body to take a picture to open her phone. Whereas it seems Annie is definitely used much more to talk about the wackiness of their situation and is used as a kind of comedic relief for the show. In that comedic relief to shut down the silliness of it or to even engage with it, only Ruby actually does that sort of thing. So in the show, I think it actually maps onto the relationship in Mean Girls. Now in Mean Girls, if you've forgotten, it's about a high school that's run by these main popular 3 three girls called the Plastics. Regina George, Gretchen Wiener, I think, and Karen, and I forgot Karen's last name. Sorry, Karen. But I think the relationship maps on quite clearly. Beth is on top in the clear and obvious way that Regina George is. Gretchen actually maps onto Ruby as a sort of second in command, and Karen maps on to Annie. Both Karen and Annie are treated often as the kind of dim-witted ones in this type of social structuring. They don't really fit into the real inside understanding of what's actually going on. And Annie is obviously treated, and they do address it in this season, that she is the uneducated one, that she doesn't know things, she makes things up on the spot, and she just expresses her own quirkiness. Now in this scene that I talk about though, it's explicitly what Ruby says to Beth after Annie walks away that had me thinking about how obviously Ruby must be the second in command. Ruby says to her, she's so weird. As if Beth would obviously agree with Ruby that Annie is a weird person in comparison to them two. Them two are the cool ones on top, and the tertiary person is treated as if not truly as cool as the top two. She's always treated as someone outside. Now in Mean Girls, they talk about how we can use these sort of internal relationships to our benefit to try and manipulate that group and take power away from Regina George, and they sort of did that in that show. So I kind of think it maps, but the only thing that might throw a wrench in this kind of comparison, I think, is the fact that Annie is actually Beth's sister. But they talk about that relationship in previous seasons. The idea that they have a kind of unique and special bond because they are sisters, so they want to protect their family, and that kind of turned Ruby off at a certain point in time, and Beth kind of had to reach out to her and be like, you are my best friend and I would stick my neck out for you. So they do talk about the relationship, the internal structures in the show, and I do think it's a kind of interesting point that they have about the show. But for the most part, I do think is this even a word? I do think the hierarchy maps on in this sort of way. So yeah, I wanted to make an episode about that, and I guess I just did. But there's a twist to this video. Yeah? Yeah. What's the twist? You really want to know? Maybe? Okay. The twist is, I think there's a lot Beth could learn from Regina George. What do you mean? Well, I think one angle that the show was gonna sort of show us, or at least one angle good shows do show us, is how people who were in that kind of good world, or in a world in a previous life, and that life changes because of the circumstances, as I discussed in the previous video, that they still had some skills or some ability or some connections from that previous life to help them in that new world. For example, in Breaking Bad. Now I'm using Breaking Bad as an example, not because it's a very often good comparison, but just because everyone can see the clear example in the case of Breaking Bad, where you have a chemistry teacher, so the chemistry teacher is unassuming, but still actually has the knowledge base to make meth and bombs. So in the criminal world was actually able to use those same skills and knowledge set that they had prior to entering that new world. Now Beth is presented as if having massive organizational skills because she has like 500 kids. I'm just kidding, she's got 4 kids. But also she's like part of the PTA board and other things, like she's really community involved and is presented as having so much organizational ability. She actually touts that as one of the reasons why Rio shouldn't kill her, and is one of the reasons why she thinks she can actually start her own organization. It also does seem like they kind of present her baking abilities, her creativity and the baking abilities in the show as if that's something that would eventually translate to the criminal world, at least in terms of making the bills, but she kind of failed in that regard because in terms of art, she actually needed a real professional artist. That's why they brought in Lucy, and so Lucy kind of makes up for the art thing. But in terms of the organizational skills, Beth really hasn't shown that skill to be uniquely powerful to her. Every time they did try to show that she is kind of organizational, like in the Secret Shopper thing, it kind of just blows up in her face anyway. Now the show is in this season trying to perhaps show that Beth is at least trying to use her man, YouTube makes talking really hard, but they're trying to make Beth so that she could use her external, how do you even talk like this? They are trying to show that Beth kind of is trying to use her more exotic elements, you could say, to kind of seduce Rio, kind of as more of a tool. It's no longer as if she's seduced by the moment in the previous season 1 or more so 2. In season 3, they are more playing into the idea that Beth is going to kind of use this type of thing to try and manipulate Rio to be in her benefit. It's literally spelled out in the scene where she discussed her action list, because she makes a list, and number 1 is to get on his good side, and that's when they show that scene with her putting on the lipstick and getting ready in that polka dot dress. She's now going to try to use her looks as a kind of skill. Rio. But Regina George already had that skill on stack. She was already using her looks and her kind of appeal to manipulate others, particularly manipulate the guys around her, even if she was only manipulating those guys to get at other women. Regina George is on a whole next level when it comes to manipulation. Beth is nothing in comparison. Beth's ability to manipulate often just comes from her directly having to lie in order to deceive somebody, like when she lied about having an affair with Rio to the FBI when she was being questioned by that agent. She more or less tries to get out of situations and deceives others by directly lying. You see, Regina George, on the other hand, actually demonstrates an ability to understand what other people would perceive and manages to manipulate others by allowing others to come to conclusions on their own. That way they will be more assertive and assured that their conclusions might be right because they don't really realize that they've been influenced by Regina George. I mean, you see, Regina George in this movie, one of the climax is that in her supreme anger, even in anger, she keeps her manipulative, masterful ability by putting herself into that hate book. A book whose name I've also forgotten at the moment, but it's a book full of insults and all the ways that they insult all the other women in the school. She enters herself into the book and turns the book in so that when people find it, they don't suspect that she was one of the people who created the book because she's in the book too, allowing other people to come to the conclusion that the only people who weren't in it was Caddy and the other girls, putting the anger on them. This was a masterful demonstration of Regina's understanding of how to manipulate others by allowing others to come to conclusions, leaving clues and tricking others to thinking what they want. This kind of ability comes from a deep understanding about other people's human behavior. Often they talk about this in detective shows as a kind of logic or deduction, but really they're not doing like formal logic like doing math, 2 plus 2. It depends on understanding how human people will behave, how humans try to deceive, and how they try to reach their own goals. Once you kind of figure out how other people's brains work, you can kind of manipulate them. And Regina George is already on that game. Beth is not. Beth could learn how to do that, because I think if Regina was in Beth's shoes, she would have already manipulated that guy who's trying to extort her. That guy who is supposed to be Rio's like #1 loyal guy who's been there from the beginning, whose name I've also forgotten. But you know, the guy who wanted the hot tub. He kind of extorted Beth on the side without the boss knowing. This isn't something that is done really loyally. In a way, this is kind of disloyal to his boss. He's trying to run his own game on the side on the same person who's supposed to be loyal to Rio. So they're kind of doing their own business without him knowing. Actually, Regina George would have flipped this switch on him. I think Regina George would have realized that this guy actually messed up in agreeing to take a payment or be bought off to do things without the boss knowing. That actually opens him up. I think Regina would have somehow collected information or proof about how this guy would have done that, sort of being disloyal to Rio, in her advantage to manipulate that guy as to being one of her pawns, or else she'll tell Leo about his disloyalty. Like I expressed in the previous video, loyalty is massively huge in the criminal world, because if you don't got money since you got robbed, you need loyalty to be able to get that money back. You need loyalty to be able to get yourself back on the feet. And the closest people to you shouldn't be people trying to rob you, but it's a constant problem. Not just in the criminal world, I guess it's also a problem when you're rich. Whenever you have a lot of something, you gotta be kind of suspicious about the people around you. So loyalty is super important. And if Rio found out that this guy is actually trying to make money off of Beth, who should be giving all her money to him instead, therefore causing a delay or a kind of reduction in the amount of Rio can get in a certain amount of time because this guy wants his own money, that might not go so down with Rio. Regina George would be on top of this. Regina George would either get him cut out or manipulate him using this as a threat into her own plans. You see, Regina George on a whole different level, I think she would have been attacking this group not with guns and warfare or anything like that, but psychological warfare. She would have already tried to get into it and really fuck up their social structure completely. I think she would have planted division and done a divide and conquer type of thing among Rio's gang crew. The only other sort of manipulative tactics that Beth sort of demonstrates comes from the very show of it being good girls. You see, all these women kind of are using the prejudice that these women, who I guess are privileged in a certain sense, that they get this prejudice that they aren't doing anything wrong because they just must be some good girls. It's a type of thing that we always talk about, you know, Pretty Little Liars, or don't be deceived by the pretty faces because they might have darker sides. Beth actually demonstrates in this show on a number of occasions, but especially well in this season when she's transporting a body in the trunk through that gate, she demonstrates her knowledge of the kind of social stay-at-home mom world in order to manipulate the cop into thinking that this is just kind of a really engaged mother who's into her kid's life and all that kind of community sort of jazz. So being a good girl and using that kind of manipulative stuff is a type of thing not to attack, it's a type of thing to defend. It's an ability to use that prejudice to fly under the radar, to be given the benefit of a doubt and not be detected as suspicious. But Regina George, on the other hand, she don't need to play on the defense. She can go on offense with her manipulative tactics. She can actually mess with their social structure. And I think Beth could learn a thing or two from Regina George in this regard. I mean, Beth does have to shape up her game in a number of ways. Now, I already brought it up in the previous video, but namely this scene in season 3 while I was doing this sort of research for this episode, where Beth is like, well, we'll make more money. And what do you think we'll do with that? We'll make more money. What do you think we'll do that? Make more money. And you know what I'm thinking? Get some security. Put some bars on your window. Protect your freaking children. Think about defense. Think about how you can possibly move this operation if you need to, like that. The same way that Rio did previously. You're sitting here thinking about, what would Rio do? You already saw what Rio could do. Rio can freaking disappear if he needs to. But y'all ain't even thinking like that. You're just thinking about what would he do in terms of power. But you're not even really thinking about what does he do in terms of operation. Like, come on, do you really want to be in a criminal world or not? You gotta figure this stuff out at some point. So in terms of this kind of versus thing going on, I kind of have a conclusion, but keep in mind that my conclusion is just a kind of joke. Don't take it too seriously. I don't really mean it. I totally mean it. So don't get too bothered by it if you disagree with my opinion. I'm definitely gonna blow it up as max proportions as I can just so that I can have as much fun with my own opinion as I possibly can, and hopefully you see that I'm having fun with it. That's kind of ultimately the point of my whole show anyway. So in terms of mean girls versus good girls, I'm kind of thinking more Regina George versus Beth. And in conclusion to that, first of all, Regina George don't need to mess with no duff. Second of all, Beth has nothing in terms of manipulation on Regina George. Regina George is queen of this stuff. You got Rio here asking Elizabeth, yeah, you want to be the boss bitch. But hell, everyone know the queen is queen from day one. We can hate her all we want. She's the villain, just like Rio is the villain. But we all know, ain't nobody in doubt that Regina George is the boss bitch. Regina George don't play defense. She don't need to go undetected and fly underneath the scenes. She look you straight in the eye and diss you to your face. For real. Regina George would have run a way better criminal organization than her. Beth all caught up in the seduction of Rio. Man, you know, if Regina George shot Rio and she wanted him, she would have got him, because Regina George gets whatever she wants. Regina wouldn't have been seduced by Rio. She would have seduced him. And even that, we know for Regina George, Rio would have just ended up being another trophy on her mantle before she starts moving on to a next thing. No lie. Beth out here in season 3 trying to use her looks as a manipulative technique. For Regina, that's some high school shit. That's like the first thing she would have used. I mean, Rio, you may have to get out of that small freaking van if you want to stop this girl. You ought to get a whole freaking bus. Regina George ran a whole school for a freaking reason. There's a reason the queen bee becomes queen. Beth would be so much greater if she had learned the laws of power and manipulation from who she should have accepted as her freaking master, Regina George 100. Regina George is a mass manipulator. Regina George got people who hate her to death still worshipping the ground she walks on. Regina George could punch a bitch straight in the face and have her say thank you. That was awesome. Nah, really, think about that. She could brainwash people to a point that they will feel blessed by her violence. Hopefully I edited that well in a really kind of fun way. If I didn't, this probably fell super flat. I hope you enjoyed my video on this comparison of Regina George with Beth, which is supposed to be a comparison really of mean girls and their kind of internal social structure with the internal social structure of the good girls. And if you like this episode, please click like and share if you're a Mean Girls fan. And also, if you really disagreed with me, don't worry about it. I get you. But we all out here having fun. Anyway, please subscribe and all the other good stuff and things. You're supposed to be my friend, and peace and victory. I just want to say on a serious note before I go though, I'm not actually glorifying bullying or trying to respect Regina George as a great person. She's obviously not a good person, but in that light, I hope we understand the same applies to Beth. I don't endorse her criminal life either. I understand that unlike Mean Girls, Good Girls is taken through the perspective of the kind of person that sort of turns bad. At the end of the day, even queens run into their foil, and real heroes emerge. Maybe Beth will run into her Katie one day. And to be honest with you, I'm really looking forward to that battle. Thanks.